Well, good morning, everyone. It's lovely to see you all this morning, your bright, smiling faces. It's wonderful. It will have become apparent to the more observant amongst you that when the scripture was read, we're not doing Revelation this morning. Did you notice? Yes, we're taking a small break from our Revelation series, and we're going to return to and finish our Luke series. Now, we started Luke my first Sunday at the Tab. Yeah, we've been going through Luke with breaks here and there for 2.5 years. I think it's time we finished. So we're going to finish Luke, not all this morning, but in the next few weeks. So we're going to pick up Luke today, and we're going to preach right through until we finished just after Easter. And what you'll see is we've been very clever. And the Luke readings will match up with our Easter events very, very nicely. So I guess really we're starting our Easter series this morning. I mean, how organised is that? However, it has been about 3 months since we've been in Luke. So picking up with the line, "But he said to them," is a bit like jumping in to watch Battlestar Galactica at season 4 and expecting to know what's going on. And the fact that nobody laughed at that, you know you would have no chance of knowing what's going on. So we're going to need just a little bit of context here as we jump back into Luke. What's been going on? What is this "but he said to them"? But what? Well, at this point, we're at the end of a series of increasing attacks on Jesus' authority. Jesus has arrived in Jerusalem, and as he makes his way through the city, he comes to the temple. And if you remember, he finds that the temple's being used as a den of robbers, to use Jesus' own words. It was filled with people really wanting to make money more than anything else, with stalls, with money changers. And it was no longer a place where people came, the focus of the place was not that people could come there to meet with God, but rather it had become a place where the leaders preyed on the people, took advantage of them, and lined their own pockets. So we read, and if you remember back to Steve's sermon, Jesus clears the temple. He shows his authority in clearing the temple, and once again establishes it as a place to meet with God and a place to hear from him, as Jesus then began teaching in the temple daily. And we read that the people hung off his every word, much to the dismay of the Jewish leaders, who were desperate to find a reason to kill him. So the people gathered around Jesus. They were lapping up his teaching, so they had to find a way to turn the people against Jesus. So they kept on coming to him with these questions that were meant to stump him, questions which were meant to undermine his authority, to try and catch him out. But we read that Jesus comprehensively answers every single one of their questions, showing us at every point that it is Jesus who has the authority, not the leaders. Jesus, he is the one who has the answers. He is the one who is able to reconcile, to bring together man and God. And it all comes to a great climax when Jesus is asked by the Sadducees about the resurrection. And his answer is so good. His answer is so good that he completely silences his opponents, and they dare not ask any further questions. So that's where we are. The Jewish leaders, they know they're licked, and they turn to walk away with their tail between their legs, trying to leave the arena of theological battle, as it were. Verse 41, but Jesus said to them. But Jesus said to them, they are done, but Jesus is not. He has one final thing to say in this discourse, one final thing to reveal, and this is where we pick up the account. This final thing that Jesus has to say comes in 3 parts. First, he begins by asking them a question. He asks them a theological question about Messiah. And then he turns to his disciples, but clearly in the hearing of all that all should hear. He warns them about these Jewish leaders. And finally, he closes by making an observation about the quiet giving of a widow just in the distance. And we may wonder what these three sayings, what these three units have in common, especially when we read it in our English translation of the Bible. And yes, I'm slightly on that hobby horse again this morning, but the titles here are inserted by man only to serve the purpose of breaking up the text even more. And Brenda read it perfectly this morning, omitting those and reading it as one account. It was great to hear it that way. Because when we put these titles in, it breaks up the text and it causes us to think of these as three separate points rather than seeing them in their full flow and their full context. Sure, there are three great sermons here. One about the two natures of Christ, one on pride and judgment, and one on giving. And those would be great sermons to hear, and we could legitimately do that. But this morning, I want us to look at what we are being taught in the flow, in the sequence of these three teachings. And I want to suggest it is this, that there is great glory in the godliness of quiet service. There is great glory in the godliness of quiet service. Let's look at the text together. Do keep your Bibles open in Luke. We're going to be pointing you back to there periodically as we go forward. So Jesus opens then with what I'm going to call a Christological conundrum, a puzzle. And it makes me think of that old riddle. I'm sure you probably have all heard it, about the man who's asked about the photograph that he's holding. And he says, "Brothers and sisters, I have none, but that man's father is my father's son." Have you all heard that puzzle? Don't think about it too hard just now, you'll be distracted. But you all know that one, don't you? It's a riddle about relationships, how one man relates to another. And that's, on the surface, that's what this conundrum looks like that Jesus is asking. Look at verse 41. He says, "How can they say that Christ is David's son? For David himself says in the book of Psalms, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool.' David thus calls him Lord. So how is he a son?" A little theological conundrum there for the Pharisees, for the scribes, for everyone who's listening. Jesus here is referring to the traditional and accepted teaching that Messiah will be David's son. That is, not his direct son, but directly in his line, in his lineage. And of course, the scribes and the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders listening have no problem affirming that. They say, yes, absolutely. Jesus begins on familiar theological ground for them. But then he asks, is that the whole story about Messiah? Is that all of it? What about Psalm 110? And he takes them back to the scriptures. Now, in Jewish tradition, Psalm 110 was not seen as a messianic psalm. It wasn't seen as a psalm about the coming Messiah. It was a royal psalm. It was a psalm that would have been read perhaps at coronations of kings. But Jesus, in asking this question, simply raises the issue. He breaks new ground for the Jewish leadership in their thinking about Messiah. And he demands careful thought and reflection upon the words of this psalm, a psalm perhaps they've known so well. Later on this afternoon, I suggest you read Psalm 110, and when you do, you can see clearly why it is considered a royal psalm. But let me also ask you, when you read it, and I know you will because I've asked you to, you tell me, when you read that, have you ever heard of a king like that? Have you ever come across a king like the one that's described here in Psalm 110? And the answer will be no. You'll have never come across a king, not an earthly king for sure, who is like this king in Psalm 110. Because Psalm 110 describes the perfect Davidic king, the perfect king who will follow in the line of David, a king who will rule perfectly and with great power. I mean, just in the opening verse of Psalm 110, as Jesus quotes it, there is such a rich description of this king, of this one that David calls Lord. Firstly, David does that. He calls him Lord. He ascribes great authority to him. A king David, a king, calls this man, this one Lord, ascribing great authority to him. Secondly, we see that this king, this one, is going to be sat at the right hand of the Father, is sat at the right hand of God, signifying his divine rule, the place of honor and of power and of rule. And thirdly, that this rule will continue until all his enemies are removed. No king, I dare say, in the history of the world has ever ruled until all of his enemies were obliterated. And the point that Jesus is making is that this isn't just any king that's being described. This is Messiah being described, the anointed one, the one who was coming, the perfect king who will reign perfectly. And what does David call him? My Lord. My Lord. And so this causes two problems for the Jewish leaders, at least two problems. Firstly, David himself recognizes two lords. The Lord said to my Lord. David affirms a plurality in the Godhead. And this is a Trinitarian statement. There's one God, and yet somehow there are two lords. But that isn't even Jesus' main point here. Rather, Jesus' focus is on their second problem. This question of authority and honor and a glory with a small g, as it were. How is it that David can call a son, a descendant of his, Lord? If in Psalm 110, David is referring to Messiah, which he is, and if Messiah is to be a son of David, which he is, then how does this fit, Jesus is asking, how does this fit with your understanding of authority and of greatness and of glory? In a patriarchal society where a son is very much under his father, is less than his father, in a society when a father receives the greater honor, how could it be that a father could ever call a son Lord? How could a father recognize a son as being greater than he, worthy of higher honor and a higher status? How can it be? It's inconceivable within their understanding of glory and greatness that one who is meant to be greater, the Father, could ever call one who is coming, a son, Lord. It's inconceivable to them unless there is something about this son which transcends the father-son relationship. And now we're getting somewhere in understanding this passage and how these three sections come together. Jesus here, in this first question, one, by the way, they do not answer, they cannot answer, is highlighting that the Jewish leadership do not understand God. They don't understand the Godhead. They don't understand Messiah. They don't understand the relationship between David and Messiah. And so, they cannot understand glory, authority, or grace. C.H. Spurgeon, in his Treasury of David, writes of Psalm 110. He says this: David was a firm believer in the unity of the Godhead. Yet he spiritually discerns the two persons, distinguishes between them, and perceives that in the second he has a peculiar interest, for he calls him my Lord. I love that bit. He has a peculiar interest in the second, for he calls him my Lord. He goes on to say, it is well to have clear views of the mutual relations of the persons of the Blessed Trinity. Indeed, the knowledge of these truths is essential for our comfort and growth in grace. Spurgeon there rightly concludes that it is only in our knowledge of God that we can grow in grace. That there is something in our spiritual walk that we need to understand the Godhead. We need to understand the relations of the Trinity. It's only by understanding it as much as we can, the Trinity, the roles of the Godhead, that we can ever begin to understand what true grace is, what true glory is, what true sacrifice is. And so Jesus' point is that the scribes do not understand the Godhead. And the conclusion I think we're meant to draw is because they do not know God. They do not know God. And so not knowing God and not knowing what he is like, they cannot be godly. And it seems to me that Jesus draws a direct line between their theology, that is, their knowledge of God, and their behavior. Look at verse 45. And in the hearing of all the people, he said to his disciples, beware of the scribes. So you can imagine that he's just said this thing to them. They cannot answer, and he immediately turns and says, beware of the scribes, who like to walk around in long robes and love greetings in the marketplaces and the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at feasts, who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. When we read this like that, ignoring that little break that's put in, it reads as though Jesus asks a question, he receives no answer, and he immediately turns to his people and says, almost, therefore, beware. Beware their behavior. Jesus has a problem with their behavior before, hasn't he? Repeatedly in Luke. We read him say, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. He said, now you Pharisees, you cleanse the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness. But woe to you, Pharisees, for you tithe mint and rue and every herb and neglect the justice and love of God. Woe to you, Pharisees, for you love the best seats in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplaces. He said this before. And the scribes and the Pharisees, it is clear, have a track record of greed, of pride, of self-importance. I'm going to suggest they had a theology of what I'm going to call glory grabbing. They had a theology of glory grabbing. They wanted to be noticed. They wanted recognition from people. And Jesus here highlights just 3 ways they do this. What does he say? He says, beware the scribes who like to walk around in long robes. These long robes were only just a small part of what was a fancy and expensive wardrobe they would wear. And it's interesting here to me that the word Jesus used and the word that Luke uses in writing this down, the word for a robe, is the same word that is used of the robe that the prodigal son receives. This robe of honor and of glory and of acceptance. And it's also the same word that's used of the robes that glorified believers receive in glory. A robe that they receive to recognize their position and their honor before God. In other words, these robes that they wear are robes that are meant to denote importance and value. But the scribes don't receive their robes from another. They may receive them from someone within their camp perhaps. But it's not something they receive, it's something they give to themselves. It's something they choose to wear, it's something they buy and they strut around in them and they like it. They also love greetings in the marketplace. Elsewhere in Luke, as we've read, Jesus rebukes them for their for their lack of love for others and their lack of love for God. But he speaks, doesn't he, of how much they love attention, public attention, and the formal greetings they would receive. Extra biblical material history from the time makes it clear that it was often a requirement that rabbis and other religious authorities received this special greeting in public. That out and about the plebs around about them must give them higher honor and higher praise, recognizing them, giving them recognition for how great they are. And we read they loved it. They loved it. They also loved the best seats in the synagogues. And they loved the seats of honor at feasts. Again, because of this status that they have received from the way they act, It is a status that allows them the best position, the position that showed and displayed most greatly their importance and their prominence. And it seems they reveled in it. They loved it. And then Jesus develops the condemnation of their actions in verse 47. He goes further. It's not just about how they look, it's what they do. They are ones who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. And Jesus says they will receive the greater condemnation. Jesus clearly contrasts their treatment of themselves with the treatment of others. And not just any others. He particularly focuses on their treatment of who were the weakest and most vulnerable of that society, widows. They take advantage of the weakest social group, the social group who are most in need, and it seems they leave them financially devastated. They devour their houses, they devour their estates. And we don't know exactly what practice that Jesus is referring to here, but it seems clear that his listeners do. There's a suggestion that perhaps they took advantage of the hospitality of widows, eating and accepting things from them for free. Or there were certain things that widows needed help with, legal advice, and the scribes, being experts in the law, would charge them to help them work out how they could meet the law, the requirements of the law. They were vultures. They preyed on the weak. And just to say, I think here the use of scribes is used as a shorthand term for all the Jewish leadership. They grabbed at glory. They wanted it. They wanted to be noticed. They wanted to be revered. They wanted the recognition. And all the while trampling down the weak and the needy to get it. You see, their idea of glory is one that pulls itself up, grabs itself up, and takes from the weak and the poor. And we may ask, why would a religious leader act this way? It's because they don't know God. That's been established. They don't know God. They reject Messiah. Their idea of glory is one that pulls itself up and takes from the weak and the poor. But Jesus' glory, God's glory, is one that lowers itself down and becomes weak and poor. Completely different. The scribes, as Jesus has revealed, understand neither the Godhead nor Messiah because they don't know him. In his opening Christological conundrum, the scribes are confused as to how a son could be referred to as Lord by his relative king. For them, the terms of Lord and Son can only ever be understood as higher and lower. How could a descendant, one who is lower, ever be considered higher? But the point is this, that Jesus is Lord first. He's always been Lord. David calls him Lord. And the Son of David second when he became incarnate. He's always been Lord, but he becomes a son. He is higher, he is greater, but he becomes lower. He becomes lower when he becomes a son. He becomes a descendant. He steps down and he joins himself with humanity. And this is what the scribes can't understand. They don't understand that this is true glory. This is true greatness. That Jesus, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. You see, the scribes thought that glory was about advancement, about people seeing you, about people thinking much of you, about seeing your splendor and your glory that you display. The scribes' understanding of glory is much like this world's, isn't it? Getting glory is about getting to the top. But Jesus' glory, where is it seen? Yes, we see him in his splendor in heaven, but we most see his glory when he comes to the bottom. At the cross. When speaking to his disciples about the cross, Jesus said, the hour has come, the cross, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. It's at the cross that he is glorified. It's at the cross that we see him as most glorious. The scribes and the Pharisees, the Jewish religious establishment are awaiting a Messiah that would rule like David, who would be powerful, who would sit on his throne and crush his enemies, who would be glorious in the way that they understood glory. But the cross, it is the cross that has become the throne of Messiah. It is from the cross, the throne that Christ sat on, from which he rules the world. And he does come in power. He does crush his enemies. But it's not from an earthly king-like throne in the first instance. It's from the cross. But they didn't understand that because they didn't know God and they didn't understand glory. Paul says the word of the cross is folly, is foolishness to those who are perishing, to those who don't know God. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. The cross is the place of God's power. It is the cross which is the power of God. It's the place from which Jesus destroys his enemies and sets his people free. It is through the incarnation where God becomes small and weak, through his life of quiet submission to the Father's will and quiet obedience. It is through his sacrificial, unjust death that he receives glory and honor and power. Hebrews 2 says, "But we see him who for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus, crowned with glory and honor." Why? Because of the suffering of death. Jesus is crowned with glory because of the cross. And it's not a glory that he grabs, though he was entitled to. It's a glory he is given. Philippians 2 says, "And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him." God has exalted him. The Father has bestowed on him the name that is above every other name, so that the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, that every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. It's at the cross that Jesus is seen as most glorious, that he brings most glory to the Father. To emulate this Christ-likeness is godliness. But what does it look like? What does it look like? Chapter 21, verse 1. Jesus looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the offering box. And he saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. And he said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on." Here is the application, is the illustration of Jesus' message, the example of the widow and her offering. It contrasts the actions here of this widow that we see described with the action of the scribes that we have heard. She is one of the very ones who the scribes would have devoured, leaving her penniless, which is what we see here. And yet she still comes, and she gave her 2 copper coins. It wasn't much. It isn't much. What she had to give wasn't much. In fact, in the eyes of the world, it was pathetic. It was scornful. In the eyes of the world, the gifts that the rich gave were much greater. They just were, by amount, greater. And would have received much more praise and glory and recognition from those around. But Jesus sees. He sees the true value of her service. He sees the true value of her gift. And he notes that it was far greater than all the others. God sees your service. You should be comforted by that. Even when nobody else sees what you do, even when nobody else cares, God sees. He notices. In terms of real cost, this widow gave the most. Her gift was most costly to her, and yet it didn't stop her from giving. Now, she could have made the excuse, couldn't she? Well, I don't have enough to live on, so I'll give later when I have more. And perhaps most of us, we'd understand that, right? Wouldn't we? We'd want to be compassionate on her situation, and we'd want to give her a pass on this one. But she doesn't take the pass that we might have given her, because she's not living for man's praise. She's not living for our opinion, but for God's glory. She's living her life in the eyes of God, not in the eyes of man. And so what does she do? She gives her all. She gives her all. She doesn't hold anything back, regardless of the cost. Jesus remarks that she did not give out of her abundance like the rest, but she gave out of her poverty, out of her nothingness, out of her emptiness, yet she gave. Here is a widow, one of the weakest in that society, someone who had no cultural importance, no power, who had received no praise or glory from man. If anything, would have received some scorn. And yet she is noticed by God and held up as a positive example of godliness by Jesus. And so I say again, there is great glory in the godliness of quiet service. Whether it be here, whether it be at church, working behind the scenes, doing things that nobody ever sees, you never get recognition for, whether it be giving lifts on a Sunday or midweek, whether it be providing meals, filling rotas, preparing Sunday school, serving in creche, all those behind the scenes visits and cards that you write and letters that you bring and gifts that you give. Well, there is great glory in the godliness of quiet service. Perhaps it's quietly getting on with your job, being overlooked for that promotion because you won't play by the world's games, even though you may be the better employee. You're not getting the recognition you deserve, but you're being a quiet witness to what true glory is. There is great glory in the godliness of quiet service. Perhaps it's in the family home. That service isn't usually quiet. But being taken for granted by your spouse or your children, or maybe just wondering if anybody realizes how hard you work. There is great glory in the godliness of quiet service. Do we see that? Do we recognize that? Do we value quiet service? After reading this, and perhaps after this message, we might say, of course we do. But do we live that way? Do we live that way? Or do we still desire recognition from others? As you would expect, I've been thinking a lot about this week as I've been preparing and trying to apply this teaching to my own life, examining my own life, and I have been surprised and made so aware of how many times the natural man within me has risen up and wanted to have recognition and wanted to have praise. Times when I've caught myself, I've just dropped a line into conversation about something I did yesterday. I just caught myself and realized that the only reason I said that is so that person would think well of me, would know that I've done something good. We are so programmed in Adam to grab at glory. Here we find it so natural in our sinful state. And everything is teed up for it. Everything is pushing towards it. This is a silly example, but it makes the point. Earlier this week, a minor Christian Twitter celebrity commented on one of my tweets. I was beaming. And my immediate reaction was, how cool am I? This guy likes what I said. I'm going to retweet it so everybody knows. And then I stopped. You know, it took everything within me not to send that retweet. I stopped and asked what my motives were. And yet this morning I've still managed to slip into my sermon. So there you go. I'll refrain from telling you who it was. And by the way, if you don't understand that reference, it's basically like bumping into Tom Hanks in the Morrison's car park and him laughing at your joke. So if you don't know that's basically what happened to me. I'm not telling anyone. No. Everything is pointing us towards getting recognition, whether it be that simple button press, whether it be telling people. We want people to know we're designed that way. Our glory grabbing like that might not be as crass and obvious as the scribes. We might not go around in our long flowing robes in the marketplace and demand that people call us sir. But we're all tempted to it. Our natural man wants recognition. Don't they know how hard I work? Do they not know how much I serve? Do they not see how hard my life is? And yes, I never complain. Maybe, like the Pharisees, I think perhaps it comes from a place of insecurity. You feel insecure, and so you feel the need to push others down in order to pull yourself up. That's what they were doing. They were demanding that others went lower so that they were comparatively higher. But that's not the gospel. That's not what Jesus is like, is he? That's the first point that Jesus made. The gospel is that in Jesus, we go down. In Jesus, we go down. And in Jesus, we can happily go down. We can happily go down into death. We can joyfully sacrifice. We can willingly die in the eyes of the world because we know that we will be brought back up again in true glory. This is the gospel. This is the glory of Messiah, of Christ, of Jesus. His glory is one that brings victory. His glory is one that brings resurrection. And the truth of resurrection, that certainty of resurrection, frees us up to die happily, willfully, willingly. It enables us to lay down our lives literally, socially, and sacrificially in the eyes of this world and in every other sense, because this world is not what we're living for. We don't want to have our best life now. That's what the scribes wanted. They wanted their best life now. That's what the world tells you to go for. But no, if this is our best life, then we've got trouble later on. We don't want our best life now. We want our best life later, in eternity. The only way we can have our best life later is to lay down our life now, of the way we want it, and repent of our ways, repent of our life, and turn to Jesus. Receive the life and the glory that he offers, even though it means carrying your cross. Let me say, it is liberating. It is freeing to throw yourself upon Jesus. To not have to worry about fighting your corner. To not feel like you have to grab at glory because you know that he's got it covered. That in him, because of him, on that final day, we will receive the commendation, "Well done, good and faithful servant." We will receive that commendation not because we've grabbed it, not even because we've earned it, but because it has been given to us in Jesus. He does it all. Paul writes, "I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Therefore," follow Jesus' words here, "deny yourself and take up his cross daily and follow him, and you will find there is great glory in the godliness of quiet service." Amen.